What is the best way to measure run creation? What wOBA, wRAA, wRC, and wRC Plus tell us about offensive value, and what that alphabet soup means. So in our last video, we discussed how to properly assign value to events in baseball. We assigned each event, single, double, home run, walk, out, etc., every single one, a run value that corresponds to the number of runs created or destroyed by that event. These values showed how on-base percentage became the vanguard of the sabermetric revolution, since it better measured a player's ability to create runs than batting average. However, using those calculated run values, we can create an even better statistic for measuring offensive value. But first, we're going to have to discuss why traditional stats fall short. What do traditional stats miss? You're probably familiar with the common ways we measure offensive production. The triple slash, batting average, on-base percentage, slugging. It's probably the most common shorthand for getting a quick grip on how good of a hitter someone is. But each of these falls short for a different reason. And let me tell you why. Batting average. The league average is 243. A 300 hitter is very good, and a 400 hitter is a mythical unicorn we haven't seen since the 40s. Those are common measuring sticks, which pretty much every baseball fan is familiar. While I don't deny that these are correct shorthands, they don't accurately measure a player's offensive production. First, batting average treats every hit as equal. A single, double, triple, and a home run are all worth the same amount. But in our last post, we showed that it's just not true. Each of these events creates a different amount of runs, so we should properly credit each hitter for the amount of runs they're creating. Second, it doesn't include all the other ways a hitter can get on base, a walk or a hit by pitch. And again, I'm going to keep referencing my last post till we get sick of it. We showed that each out is a direct loss of runs. By not including the other ways a batter reaches base, we are not accurately capturing their run production. A batter with a high on-base percentage is creating more runs than a batter with a high batting average and a lower on-base percentage. There's no way around that. Finally, batting average relies a lot on luck. Sometimes you hit a rocket, but it's right at someone. Or maybe the defense played you just right, and even though you're matching, it's right at the defenders every time. And it also works the other way. Soft contact can result in a bloop hit. Now, I won't deny there is some skill involved in ball placement, and some fast runners can leg out balls that others wouldn't. But a lot of it is luck. And this is why batting average on balls in play has become a popular measure to see if a guy is lucky or not. Because it can tell you if a guy's getting really lucky or if it's skill. I'll make a whole another post on this in the future. Next is RBIs. As Keith Law, a senior writer for The Athletic, puts it in his book, Smart Baseball. The RBI stat is responsible for more bad postseason award decisions than any other single factor in baseball history. And as many people have said in my comments, all that math doesn't account for a guy driving in runs. And I did say we should properly credit for how many runs they're producing. But RBIs doesn't measure that either. It's a stat completely dependent on how good the batters in front of you are at getting on base. In his historic 73 home run season, Barry Bonds came up to the plate with the bases empty in 54% of his at-bats. He ended up driving himself in that season more than any of his other teammates, and it resulted in a season that didn't even crack the top 120 for most RBIs. Additionally, if you look at Bonds' 2004 season, where he was intentionally walked 120 times, his teammates who hit directly behind him ended up with 77 RBIs each, and each with only 11 home runs. If that is not enough to show you that RBIs are entirely context dependent, they are also not very good at predicting next season performance. There isn't any strong correlation with RBIs and a player's run creation the following year. On-base percentage. I won't deny it, on-base percentage is better than batting average, including all the ways a batter can reach base, and therefore creates more runs. And as you're probably sick of me saying at this point, outs cost runs. And on-base percentage is a proxy for a batter's rate of creating outs. If a batter has an OBP of 400, he is creating runs in 40% of his at-bats and costing runs in 60% of them. It is at its core a very simple measure of how often a batter creates runs. However, it has the same issue as batting average. On-base percentage treats all events as if they're equal. And again, as you're probably sick of me saying, they're not equal. A single, double, and triple in the eyes of on-base percentage are all the same. Slugging percentage. What if we instead tried to credit each event by the total number of bases it resulted in? Slugging percentage does just that. A single is worth 1 base, double 2 bases, a triple 3 bases, and a home run 4 bases. Right off the bat, there are a couple of problems. Slugging percentage doesn't include walks or hit by pitches, which automatically puts it a peg below on-base percentage. Second, if we're saying a double is worth twice as much as a single, and a triple 3 times, and a home run 4 times, as we showed in our last post, that's just not right. While a double and triple and a home run are better than each other, they aren't 2x, 3x, and 4x more. So slugging percentage does give you a quick idea of a batter's extra base hit ability, but it doesn't give us a good understanding of how many runs a batter creates. What about OPS? So OPS asks the question, what if we just combined the two statistics that we know are better than batting average? Is that an improvement? The answer is kind of, but there are still some issues with using this as a hitting evaluator. One, being it's just bad math. You may remember from middle school that you can't add two fractions with different denominators. But that's exactly what OPS is doing. OBP is measured per plate appearance, while slugging percentage is measured per at-bat. Yet, for some reason, we just ignore this inconsistency and add the two numbers up. The second issue is that OBP is still more valuable than slugging percentage. Yet OPS, again, treats them as equal. As Keith Law again points out, say you're comparing a player with a 400 OBP and a 400 slugging to a guy with a 300 OBP and a 500 slugging. OPS would value them the same. However, the 400 OBP guy is on average going to create 60 less outs than the 300 OBP guy. And those 60 outs are more valuable than the extra base hits the 500 slugging player gets you. The actual numbers work out to OBP being almost 2 times more valuable than slugging. OPS became popular because it was simple for analysts to communicate to audiences. But that does a service to fans and a discredit to you to understand slightly more complicated ideas. Analysts simply never took the time to explain how wOBA and wRC+ are better measures of offensive value. Well, I believe fans deserve more than that, which is why I'm going to lay it all out. Measuring individual run creation. So previously, we established run values for each event in baseball. So how do we use these values to measure run creation? Turns out it's pretty straightforward. Basically, we're just going to multiply these run values times the number of events for each of these players. But first, we have to make one adjustment. We're going to scale these numbers so an out is worth 0. This doesn't change the value of any of these relative to each other. It just kind of makes the math easier and easier for us to interpret, because an out in batting average and on base percentage is worth 0. So we're just kind of putting everything on the same scale. Think of it like, say, sea level. We say a mountain is a certain elevation above that, and that elevation is relative to the height of the ocean. We're kind of doing the same thing here. We can say that a player is creating this many runs above sea level, where sea level is average, and that sea level is going to be 0. So if a player creates outs in every one of his at-bats, 0. Sea level. Also, this has the added bonus of what you'll see in the equation later, of just zeroing out outs. So after scaling an out to 0, here's our new values. So now we can get run creations values for each player. So over the last 3 years, Aaron Judge created 680 runs compared to what was expected, and Juan Soto created 683. And remember, a player who created an out in every at-bat is going to have a value of 0. Now, this is a perfectly fine way to compare the amount of runs created by each player. However, this is a counting stat, and you can see from the numbers over here, some players may have gotten to the plate more than others. For the same reason we use batting average and on-base percentage, we're going to turn this into a rate stat. This is also pretty straightforward. First thing we're going to do is we're going to scale these run values so our final number is similar to on-base percentage. We do this simply because it's more interpretable. We can look at a player's wOBA and use that same intuition that we're able to use for identifying good on-base percentage. It's really just because it's simpler for our brains. The number varies from year to year based on the league environment, and you can find every one of those at the link below on Fangraphs. But for the last 3 years, the wOBA scale number was 1.2. So now, we can just put it all together. You'll see this equation on Fangraphs and many other places with the wOBA number kind of already distributed to the values. But I think it's a little bit easier to understand by keeping it separate. So you can see the direct relationship between the run values we created earlier and the final output. Next, we just divide by plate appearances, and that gives us our final wOBA equation. So what does wOBA tell us? wOBA is a descriptive rate stat that attempts to measure individual offensive value. By crediting each event with the individual run value, we are properly weighting offensive outcomes. It's also an improvement over slugging percentage, which improperly scales outcomes versus each other. Now that we're using the proper run values, our rate stat appropriately measures the offensive value of a player. Here are the leaders for the last 3 years. There's a lot of names you're familiar with, and probably some that you're surprised by, and didn't realize just how good they are at producing runs. It also illustrates just how damn good Aaron Judge is. Additionally, because we did that scaling thing earlier, we can interpret this in the same way as we did on base percentage. 400 is excellent, 320 is average, 300 below is pretty bad. But wOBA is not perfect. It's a huge improvement over other statistics we have discussed, but there's still some of this part of the story it doesn't quite tell us. wOBA is an awesome descriptive tool for telling us how good an individual player is. But if we want to ask the question, how much better is this player than others? We need a different number, and we do this by comparing each player to the league average. This allows us to say something like Shohei Ohtani created 50 more runs than the average player. A number like this is ideal for getting us to our ultimate question of evaluating one player against another. wRAA and wRC. This is how weighted runs above average and weighted runs created were born. Essentially, we're just going to compare an individual player's wOBA to the league average and convert that back to our non-scaled number. Multiply this by that player's plate appearances and you have your wRAA. Here's the equation. We're going to break it down a little. So this part is the key component. We are calculating how much better or worse this player was compared to league average. The individual player's wOBA minus league average, which leaves us how much better they are than league average. Then by multiplying it by plate appearances, we get a total number of runs above average. A complete average player would have a wRAA of 0. wRC is essentially the same calculation, but communicated a little bit differently. We're going to add the league average back in so that we can estimate the total number of runs created by that player. This is the equation. It's a little bit easier to understand if we break it down further. Same as before, we're calculating how much better that player is than the league average. You can probably recognize this component from the earlier equation. But now, we're going to calculate the average number of runs per plate appearance. And we're going to add that back in. And you calculate this simply by summing up all the runs scored over a time period and dividing that by the number of plate appearances. By adding in the league average run production, we're essentially saying this player created their above average contribution plus what an average player would have contributed over the same number of opportunities. So you get this kind of sub-equation of total runs created equals above average contribution plus average contribution. And that's how you get the total. So you can kind of interpret it a little bit differently by using our earlier equation. wRC is wRA plus the league runs per plate appearances times plate appearances, which is just league runs. Above average contribution plus average contribution. And if you look at the leaders for wRA and wRCC, you might see some names you previously undervalued as hitters. Like if you look at wRC, there's a guy, Kyle Schwarber, who by traditional metrics is not that great, but he's really good at creating runs. And he's also really good at staying in the lineup. That's why he has such a high wRC value without being in the top 10 for wRAA. And you might see some names that we didn't see earlier in the wOBA numbers. You see Matt Olson, who's one of the top 10 hitters by wRAA and wRC. So these two stats essentially communicate the same thing, but in different ways. For example, from 2022 to 2024, Freddie Freeman had a wRAA of 130.8 and a wRC of 375. This is essentially saying over the last 3 years, Freddie contributed 139 runs above the average player, and in total, that was 375 runs. Another player, like Jordan Alvarez, contributed 138.8 runs above average, and 338 total runs. If we were going to by counting stats alone, we would say Freddie had a higher value, but that's probably because he accumulated 400 more plate appearances than Jordan did. When we evaluated by wRAA, you can see that Jordan put up a higher number of runs above average and less plate appearances, which would indicate that he probably has more value. He's probably more valuable on a per plate appearance level. Additionally, how do we compare two players that play in different stadiums? A player for the Mariners and the Rockies play in extremely different park environments. Context matters. And we need a number that is context dependent so we can truly compare one player's offensive ability to another, wRC plus. So how do we do that? Turns out we already have the bones of that calculation with wRC and wRAA. We just need to add park and league adjustments. So now we kind of get this behemoth of an equation. And we're going to walk through this one step by step again. So wRA, weighted runs above average per plate appearance, is another way of saying how many runs above average does this player contribute per plate appearance. So if you look at it again, this is kind of essentially the same thing as our wOBA calculation, just in a different way with league average added back in. We then scale this number with league and park adjustments. So this is where it gets interesting. Essentially what we're doing here is we're increasing or decreasing the amount of runs a player is creating per plate appearance based on where he plays. So if a player plays most of his game at Coors Field, we're going to decrease their runs by a certain number because the altitude of Denver is inflating those run values. Conversely, a player who plays in Seattle will increase their runs created to account for all that extra gravity. And if you want to read a really interesting article, I'll link it below. It's really interesting that actually last season, Seattle had a crazier run effect than in Coors Field. I'm going to have a lot more to say about how exactly these park adjustments are done in a later post. So now we're going to compare this number against the league average so that we can interpret how much additional value a player is contributing. As you can see, this number is league adjusted, AL or NL, and it's wRC per plate appearance, excluding pitchers, a number we created earlier. Finally, we just multiply this number by 100. So if you are interpreting these numbers, a 175 wRC plus would mean that a player created 75% more runs than a league average hitter in the same number of plate appearances. So going back to our Freddie and Jordan example, we can see that Jordan has a wRC plus of 174. This means he's contributing 74% more runs than average. Freddie has a wRC plus of 153, which means he's contributing 53% more runs. Both amazing, both top 10 in the league. So now we have park and playing time dependent stats to compare these two. Using wRAA and wRC, we might have said that Freddie had more offensive value. Once we include park and league effects, we see that Jordan actually has higher offensive value. In fact, Jordan was the second highest offensive value in the league over the last 3 years. Only Aaron Judge has a higher wRC plus, a whopping 202. So here are the league leaders over the last 3 years. Again, a lot of names you probably recognize, and probably one you never would have thought of. My favorite wRC plus surprise is that Yandy Diaz is a top 10 offensive player over the last 3 years. On a 3-year and $24 million deal, you can see just how good the Rays are at finding value. So what is the best way to compare offensive value? All these numbers we've discussed have some merit in measuring different aspects of offense. Some are definitely better than others. If you're going to choose only one, I would go with wRC+. It is the only number that takes into account where a player plays, what the league was like that year, and compares it to the run environment for that season. wRC Plus gives us the ability to compare players across leagues and seasons. It is also scaled correctly for all the different ways a player can contribute and accounts for playing time. Take a look at the all-time wRC Plus leaders. This is one of the reasons I think baseball is so awesome. Thank you to all the nerds who kept all the detailed stats back in the day, because now we have this crazy ability to compare players across time periods. We can see just how good Babe Ruth and Ted Williams really were. And we can also see how good some of the current players are. Aaron Judge, Mike Trout, Juan Soto, all in the top 15 all-time best run producers. Now, there is something to be said for a counting stat, because there's also value in staying healthy. I pointed out Mike Trout earlier. Someone like Mike Trout hasn't played a full season in 5 years. Even though his wRC Plus is one of the highest in the league, he's ranked 5th in wRC Plus from 2021 to 2024. He definitely hasn't contributed much value because he just hasn't seen the field a lot. If we were to look at a stat like wRC, and eventually we'll get to WAR, trust me, I'll get there. He's ranked 128th. Essentially, when Mike Trout plays, he's still one of the best players in the game, but he just hasn't played that much. So like most things in life, measuring offensive value is a nuanced question. By properly weighing outcomes, wOBA opened a door to more complex analysis. I think it's truly the gateway stat for understanding more complicated analysis. Weighted runs above average and weighted runs created built upon that to give us a player's value in terms of absolute runs. But when asking who creates the most offensive value, there's no better way than wRC+. In future posts, we're going to get into how you can try to project these things into the future using underlying values from StatCast. Think things like launch angle, exit velocity, bat speed, barrels, those kind of stuff. But first, we're going to have to address the other side of the equation. Can we apply the same context-dependent approach to evaluating pitching? Turns out we can. See you in the next one.